So yeah, I'm Brian. I've been working in the European Environment Agency for several years now on biodiversity. And I spent all of my professional career, bar two, working on biodiversity. And those 2 years I spent on archaeological heritage. So still in the heritage conservation world. Yeah, I just mentioned I've worked at the Irish level for government. I've worked at a European and a global level. I suppose I'm lucky and I do a job that I really enjoy. So I'm very happy in that way. I'm passionate about biodiversity and nature, and I hope during this presentation I might transfer some of that to you. What I'd like to do is give you a bit of an overview as to maybe what is biodiversity, what are maybe the current state of this, what are the challenges, and maybe what are we doing or trying to do, and why should we do what we're doing. So a little bit about the agency, and I'm going to hopefully make sure all of the buttons press when I'm changing screen slides. Okay, that is, it's just a bit slow. So the European Environment Agency, I'm not too sure how many of you may have heard of us. I'm sure if we did a poll of that, it might not be particularly good. But we're an agency of the European Union, and we were created actually 30 years ago in 1994, where we were created to really help understand the state of the environment in Europe. Back in the 80s, after the Chernobyl incident in Ukraine, the countries in Europe were trying to work out, like, we knew there was a problem, but we couldn't work out how we could be harmonized in what we were doing in the response to this problem, because every country was measuring and monitoring things in very different ways. So when the countries of Europe got together to try and say, what could we do about this? What do we need to do about this? It was very difficult to make a kind of a nuanced, intelligent decision about what to actually do, because you had so many different ways of doing things. So that was a bit of a stimulus to have an agency on looking after the environment in Europe. So we work with the EU, 27 countries of the EU, plus 11 other countries, so 38 countries in all across Europe. You can see here in the map. And we work with all of these different countries to collect information on the environment, be it air quality, is it water quality, noise pollution a little bit, and my area is biodiversity. And we do this and we collect it and we try to analyze it and we try to track how we're doing towards different policy targets and what the overall condition of these elements are. And then we try to do a lot of work to help inform policymakers about the importance of the environment from the different dimensions of the environment. And that's really what we're probably, as we've evolved in that 30 years, we've gone from just collecting the data and making a simple assessment to really trying to say, well, why should you care about this? And really highlighting the different connections between things. And one of the reasons we do this, of course, is that there's this triple planetary crisis. And this is a language you may or may not have heard, but this is language that comes from the UN, where they talk about the fact that we have a pollution crisis, a climate crisis, and a biodiversity crisis. And combined, they're called that triple planetary crisis. And the reality is that these things are so interlinked as well that you can't solve one without working on the other ones as well. So the solutions to these are all connected across. And what really kind of happens is these unfortunately amplify the challenges in the other areas. So the pollution crisis amplifies the biodiversity crisis, which amplifies the climate crisis. And then they tend to kind of escalate each other as well. So declining biodiversity means that we have an increased climate crisis. Increase in pollution means invariably you have a biodiversity loss. So there's this cause and effect happens, and the worse we do in these, the worse it is for everything else. So that's a lot of what we're trying to really do. And I suppose over the course of my career, what I've seen is that I've spoken a lot about that small bubble of biodiversity loss. But increasingly now, I need to bring in these other arguments and discussions and solutions as well. So maybe a first bit about biodiversity and what it actually is. So I always kind of say that there's a lot of definitions of what biodiversity is and what nature is and what the differences between them are. But what I say really, biodiversity or nature, while there's a technical difference between those, effectively what they are, they're basically the life support system of our planet. It helps, our planet adapt and be resilient to different global challenges. It stabilizes our climate and our processes. And it's really that foundation of our health, our economy, and even our culture as well. And these are two photographs from Ireland where I always try and bias any presentation with some Irish pictures in there. But for me, when I look at these are very evocative for me personally, for my culture. And that's, biodiversity for me resonates immediately with that. But then, they're both important areas for agriculture and for tourism, and they're iconic from an Irish identity perspective. And that's really, when you think about biodiversity beyond the plants or the animals, and you start seeing these different layers to it, you start appreciating it more and more. And a bit more about the value about biodiversity. And I'll try to talk a bit more in the next few slides as to probably why you care about biodiversity, even if you don't care about biodiversity. We did this report a few years ago called Signals in Biodiversity, and we tried to really kind of explain why people should care. And there's this, in the academic world, we often confuse things by using very difficult to understand language. And one of these things we talk about is ecosystem services. And what that really means is how does biodiversity nature provide for us? And we have these different ones which we call provisioning, and that's just kind of giving you something. And that's where you've got fertile soil, you've got fresh water, you've got clean air, you've got diversity so crops can grow. There's other ones that help regulate our planet. We call those regulating services. And that's for pollinating. It's about, shade from trees in urban areas. It's, storing and sequestering carbon and monitoring pests and purifying the water that is provided above. And then there's that cultural element about, how you and I will go out and we'll interact with the nature. And, we translate that into a term called cultural services. So it's really just kind of say that nature biodiversity has all these different values and they're often happening at the same time. And just, another example of why it's important for us is that if we think about pollinators, there's different insects that we see or maybe don't see very often these days around our gardens or our fields. They're essential for agriculture and food security in Europe and globally as well. So we have some facts here. So like 84% of crop species in Europe and 78% of wildflower ones depend on pollination. And there was some figures done by the Joint Research Centre, which said that, if you were to try and estimate that, you'd be talking about 15 billion euro annually is given away for free by these pollinators to help agricultural outputs. And the last I heard on that was probably a very strong underestimate. So again, if we didn't have these pollinators, we would have to do this artificially. And as I always say, if we don't have pollinators, we've no apples, almonds, avocados, bananas, chocolate, coffee, tea, tequila, tomatoes. The list can go on and on and on. So again, I love chocolate, for example. So a world without chocolate isn't worth living in. But that's dependent on pollinators. And we really see this as we look into our world around us, the importance of it. I've got a few more slides with a bit more of an economic feel because as I've been giving presentations over the last few years, I felt I need to bring in different language into this. So this was some work that was done by an organization called the World Economic Forum back in 2020. And they did some work and they said about half of the world's GDP, which they estimated to be $44 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature. The rest of it still is, but to a lower extent. And they kind of said that exposes half of the world's GDP to high risks from anything that's affecting nature or biodiversity. We did some work with the European Central Bank last year and the European Investment Bank. And from that analysis, it was within the Eurozone in the EU, there was at least 3 million companies were dependent on at least one ecosystem service. That was that slide I showed you. And I think if we opened up the kind of conversation a bit more, I'd probably put a 0 behind that 3. That's how many companies are in there. And then when we looked at it from a kind of a financial perspective, 75% of bank loans to companies which are granted in the Eurozone are highly dependent on at least one ecosystem service. So straight away, this kind of unlocks language from businesses about risk and compliance and so forth. So, it's using a language of a business world to kind of highlight the importance of biodiversity. And, I've been saying how important biodiversity is for many years, but you have people like Frank Elderson, who's the vice chair of the European Central Bank, who basically says, while humanity needs this as well, but the economy and banks do as well. So certainly what we're seeing is a growing appreciation of the importance of biodiversity. And there's been a lot of studies done about how do you value this? And, it's very difficult, which is one of the challenges that we have. but it's, I always kind of say, you could try to work out how much would it cost to replace what is there. And also that kind of intrinsic inherent aspect about it, how do you value the priceless is always a challenge. But having said all of that about the importance and how we rely on biodiversity, when we go back to check the actual state of biodiversity, it's quite harrowing. This is some work that we do in the European Environment Agency with 27 countries across Europe, where we work with, I think there's about 35,000 people work on all of this across the board, working in the 27 different countries and bringing up. And what we do is we have some policies, and I'll come to those a bit later on, but they have a list of habitats like forests and grasslands and peatlands, and a list of species that are meant to be protected under EU law. And what happens is every 6 years, countries are meant to be doing assessments and evaluate where are they in terms of the health or the status of these lists of species and habitats. And when we do this, we see the fact that when we look at habitats, there's 81% of them are considered to be poor or bad. For birds, it's a slightly better figure. It's just under 40%. And then for those other species which aren't birds, it's about 2/3 of them. And we also see that the trend for the future is either decreasing or unknown. And often if it's unknown, it's bad. So these figures show us the fact that even though we understand we're very reliant on biodiversity, that the actual state of it at the moment is in a very precarious position. I would say we do know why this is happening, and we do know what we could be doing to resolve this. But this is some of the key work that we do in the agency, is to really put these figures in place and say, well, this is where we're at. Now, talking about why these figures are the way they are, we know, again, and this is a graphic from the State of Nature report, and I can share the links with you in this presentation afterwards. We know that one of the biggest drivers of those figures being so bad is intensification of agriculture and intensification of fishing. We see that climate change is becoming increasingly important. Going back to that triple crisis, pollution is very important. And then just changing land from a more natural to a more artificial one is increasingly becoming a problem. But the biggest ones are those intensification of agriculture and intensification of fishing. And that's where we really need to see what we can do to modify that. And agriculture and fishing require healthy biodiversity to succeed going forward. So it's one of these things where we really need to have healthy biodiversity so we can have a productive agricultural system, an effective fishing system. But the more we do it in the wrong way, the worse it gets. So it's this kind of, you get a self-fulfilling prophecy of it getting worse and worse and worse. Then linking back to maybe third slide as well, with this triple planetary crisis, we know it's not just the biodiversity crisis. There's also this climate crisis. There's been a lot of discussion in the news about the Conference of Parties in Baku and Azerbaijan about trying to get a deal on this, and where are we with this 1.5 degree from Paris. The graph here with the multiple lines is sea temperature in Europe and the globe since 1880. And we can see while there's a lot of wiggles up and down in this, overall the trend is increasing and increasing and increasing. And the worrying thing for that is that what we're seeing is that the ocean, which is really our insulating factor against the extremities of climate, is getting warmer and warmer. That means it can absorb less and less carbon dioxide. It's becoming a bit more acidic, which means that a lot of the very small micro marine animals that have shells on them, those shells are breaking down easier and easier because it's just a chemical reaction. If you have a shell, which is mainly calcium, and then you have an acid, it starts breaking down. And this is our problem we're seeing, is that increasing temperatures in the ocean are bad news for us as a society overall. And this, on the other side of the screen, we got these famous biodiversity stripes, and there's also probably a less famous, famous climate stripes. There's also probably a less famous decreasing biodiversity stripes. And what you're seeing here is that as you move to the right-hand side of the screen, we're getting a darker red color, which shows that on average, the temperatures are increasing. On the biodiversity one, we're going to a grayer color, which shows on average, the proportion of species is decreasing. And Miles Richardson, who did this one, has a series of these different graphics for different species, and they show slightly different pictures what's happening, but they're all pretty consistent what's going on. So then maybe a little bit on what we're actually doing about this. So at a European level, we have several policies. The main ones I'll go through here, but there's a lot of other ones, and there's a load at national level as well that can be. So the biggest ones for biodiversity in Europe are what we call the Birds and Habitats Directive. The Birds Directive was first created in 1979 to protect, several hundred birds of European importance. In 1992, the Habitats Directive was created to be a sister directive to this birds one, and that really talked about what can we do to protect nature in Europe. That was the first attempt to really go, okay, we need to do this, we need to do it now. There've been a lot of different iterations of those different directives and what was been happening in different policies. And at the moment, we have a biodiversity strategy for 2030 in the European Union, which I'll discuss in a little bit. And then we have a global biodiversity framework. And this is a global target that countries have signed up to help improve biodiversity. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But one of the main things that this biodiversity strategy did was it created a regulation, a law across Europe called a nature restoration regulation. And that's been very topical for the last 2 or 3 years. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So this biodiversity strategy for Europe, it was launched in May 2020 by the then Commissioner Sinkovicius, and was part of what we called in the EU the Green Deal. And this was a way of the Commission at the time, under Ursula von der Leyen, was saying we need to integrate the environment into what we're doing as a society. It can't be one of these things that's somewhere out here. It has to be kind of what we call mainstreamed or heavily integrated. And one of the ways for that was that the EU would say, we're going to have a relatively ambitious strategy on biodiversity. And there was basically 4 pillars to that. And it said we need to increase the amount of protected areas we have in Europe. And they set a target of 30% in land and sea by 2030. We need to restore biodiversity through a restoration law. And then they said we want to enable transformative change. What that really means is say, how can you get people to appreciate that biodiversity is fundamental for what they're doing? There's that slogan from the United States Clinton election of it's the economy stew, but I always say it's the biodiversity stew, but it's that integral part of what we're doing. And the other part as well of that, the last pillar was how can the EU and European member states be leaders in tackling biodiversity loss at a global level? And with that, maybe the last one, in 2022, delayed because of COVID, there was this Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or the Biodiversity Plan as it's been called. And I had 23 different targets to help improve and restore biodiversity across the planet. The 2 big ones that I work on a lot are this target 2 on restoring ecosystems or biodiversity, and target 3, protecting or conserving land. And again, there's a 30% target for both of those. So the EU is really trying to work with this, and it steered a lot of the language for this global plan. It was driven by the EU targets as well. And unprotected areas, which is something you may or may not be aware of, but these are the classic nature reserves or national parks that you probably maybe might be near where you live or where you might go visit on holidays. So what we did in the biodiversity strategy was they laid out some ambitions and commitments. And what they said, they don't just want to have more of these. They want to make sure that they're protecting really key elements of Europe's kind of biological and cultural heritage, such as old growth forests, and make sure that they're not just what we call paper parks, that they're actually doing something. And that's what we call effectively managed. So in terms of where we are with this, so we as an agency, we work with all the different countries in Europe to collect this information and do assessments and analysis of this. And we have about 26% of our land covered and 12% of our ocean covered. And if you compare that globally, we're probably not in a bad place overall, but we're still shy of this 30% target. And globally, we're well shy of the 30% target. We need to double it on land and over triple it in the ocean. And in Europe, we're maybe not quite as extreme in that, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And that's what we as an agency, we track this and we help the European contribution to the global dimension. The other element we do a lot of work is restoration. And this restoration regulation, if anyone was following news and the environment over the last few years, you probably came across this. But this was first announced in 2020, as I said. And the idea was that we would have this law to just restore nature, and those figures I showed of 81% habitats being bad, the aim was to just reverse that, so that we could say 81% of habitats are good because we've done this. So the idea was to make a law across Europe to do this. But then it got very political, and there was a lot of discussion about this. And it was one of these things where I'm waiting for the drama to come out about this, because I would definitely watch it. Maybe no one else would. But it really was a case of, how do you get this very ambitious policy through agreement of 27 countries? And how do you deal with the politics of those, and what it talks about, changing land use and sea use? So basically, in June of this year, after a lot of politicking and some very last minute change of mind by the Austrian government, the law was actually adopted. It was approved in what we call the EU's Environment Council. This is a meeting where the ministers of environment from the different countries in Europe meet, and they voted upon it. That then set the ball in motion for this law to be put through and adopted. And what the law talks about is that for 20% of Europe's land and sea, we will have active measures in place. So countries will tell us exactly what are they going to do to change that figure of decreasing trend and the bad values into something more positive. And so we're working a lot with countries to do this. And then by 2050, all ecosystems that need help will have it. And it talks about all of these different habitats and species I mentioned in the marine environment, but also in urban environment and connecting rivers and floodplains, improving pollinators, helping improve agroecosystems, agricultural land and grassland, so that it's effective and it's, the soil is fertile and long-term sustainability, and improving the biodiversity in the forests as well. And what countries are going to do in about a year and a half, just over a year and a half, countries are going to write this down, what they're going to do in something called a National Restoration Plan. And we'll be working with them on this. And by 2032, we're doing an EU-wide review of all the actions laid out in the plan. So it's going to be a large amount of work, but this is really where countries are going to tell us what are they actually going to do to help improve biodiversity. And really what the law does is it talks about transforming degraded habitats and revitalizing them. It talks about expanding urban green spaces. It talks about saving our pollinators, that 15 billion euro that we give to agriculture. How can we increase that? It talks about enhancing biodiversity in farmlands and in forests, and also in wetlands, which are very important carbon sinks for us. And what this really will end up doing is it will improve what we call the resilience of biodiversity and our planet, but also climate resilience. It'll increase green space. There's a lot of targets in this law that are very specific about urban areas, more trees and so forth, more green space. That will then help tackle air pollution and improve our human health. And there's been a lot of studies talking about how, as humans and as animals, when we're in nature, our brain waves are a bit different. We're more relaxed than we are when we're in a more urban environment. And, they always say, if you're stressed, go out for a walk in nature and you become more creative afterwards. It will help mitigate the effect of these extreme events that we're seeing increasingly across Europe and across the world. And that's because, we're not resilient to do it. And it'll safeguard these different services I talked about, make sure that our food is both sustainable and secure. There's also then a lot of benefits monetarily about this. So they talk about investing, and there's a lot of discussions here about, the cost of what this would be for Europe, 154 billion estimate, but the return of that investment, what the benefits will give you back, are probably like nearly 10 times that. There's a little bit of debate about these exact figures, but a lot of the studies I've seen, they're very clearly, it's several orders of magnitude more for every euro you put in that you get out from either clean water or healthy air or pollinators or recreational area or just better food. And then maybe a bit more about what we do in the agency as well, is we try to provide knowledge on this. And I'll throw a few slides just highlighting what it is that we're doing. My computer says I don't have to work again. So what we tried to do in the agency, as I said in probably my second slide, was we tried to inform and discuss things. We have a few different fora for doing that. One is this information system called the Biodiversity Information System for Europe. We try to get a lot of this information, and we try to encourage countries and to update the information. We do a lot of work highlighting what we know about protected areas. There's this figure I've given about the coverage on land, but we know it varies by different member states. It changes on land, it changes on sea. Some areas have a higher proportion of protected areas than other areas, but our website gives a lot of this information. And, I think if you're ever doing any work on this, it's a very useful tool to give you an introduction as to what is actually happening. We have these country pages as well. I picked Ireland because it's what I'm more familiar with. We try to take the information we have on biodiversity and environment and put it together into something hopefully understandable and meaningful. You can see here is just a few extracts from the data sets that we have. We try to present the facts and the figures in hopefully an understandable way. We talk about what the country might look like and what Ireland is doing to protect its environment, and maybe there's a mismatch with different things. So we have a lot of data, particularly in protected areas. We know where, we know how much, and we have a lot of information for this Natura 2000 network. And Natura 2000 is it's a product of these nature directives, the Habitat and Birds Directive, and there's 27,000 sites across Europe. And for all of those ones which are designated by countries, we have information on the species and habitat, so the what and where things occur. We have a map viewer, which you can access it, and there's another resource where you can get a bit more information about what is this Natura 2000, what's it trying to do, why does it exist in the first place, what the benefit for me is. And this is all publicly accessible information. I've been working on making sure that it's easy to digest. We previously had these versions that were really only useful to myself and two of my colleagues who understood it because they weren't really useful for the wider public. We've been trying to work on that and make it kind of cleaner and tidier. For all of these 27,000 sites, so you can go in and you can zoom in on those, and you can notice search as well. You can find out the ones near you. For all of those sites, and this is an example from Germany, we know exactly how many habitats and how many species there are in there. We also know the threats and the pressures affecting that site, and we're asking countries for information about what are they doing to protect this site. We also then connect that across to information on the condition of those habitat and species in different across Europe. This is an example. That previous site had these active raised bogs. We have a portal that tells you what is the state of those and shows you where they are in Europe. And we can see in this case that the state of them is overwhelmingly bad. In the one region of Europe, the continental region, it is poor. And then we can see that several countries have a very large number of these sites and a large area of those sites. You can look across on a map and you see the Baltics and Finland and Sweden and Ireland have a huge proportion of these areas. So they're very important for it. And when you look at those, I can see in the Boreal region, which is Scandinavia, it's in a bad condition. The Atlantic region, where Ireland is, it's in a bad condition. So this is all about trying to make information more accessible and aware. We have a lot of information on forests as well. We have an information system on forests as well as for water, freshwater and marine. And this tries to tell you a lot about forest, the different types of forest, the density of it. And then we also have a tool where we track there was a pledge made to have 3 billion trees planted in Europe by 2030. So we have a website where countries or anyone can submit their information and get an understanding of where they are with this. And we kind of make this available. It's kind of being openly transparent with the information. We also try to publish a lot of information with these regular briefings and reports. And if you go to the agency's website, there is, I think it's communication or press releases on the top, and it gives you a quick list of what we're doing. So you can see in the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've been talking about tackling pollution and energy, ensuring justice and a sustainable transition, talking about trends and projections in greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity-friendly farming practices, and so forth. So we tried to cover a lot of different areas and regular contributions to those. In my area, we do this big report on the state of nature. This is our what we call our flagship product, where really it sets out the evidence base of where we are and where we want to go to. The last one was done in 2021. The next one will be done in 2026. And that was the genesis of those figures I showed of the 81% habitats being poor or bad. Recently, we did work on the state of water across Europe. And again, we highlighted what is causing, what's the state of water in Europe and what's causing any concern we might have. And we see that the state of water varies across Europe, but overwhelmingly there are challenges happening. We see there's a lot of pollution and degradation of habitats, are a big pressure on the quality of water in surface water and groundwater, and agriculture, unsurprisingly, is the most significant pressure. This is about, the runoff from pesticides and insecticides that go into rivers and go into the groundwater as well, where then they pollute the drinking water that we have and animals have as well. We did work recently looking at how you can have biodiversity-friendly farming practices. So it's a case of, the agricultural sector is always the problem. No, it's the solution as well. And we tried to identify a series of what we call win-wins. for both the farming community and for biodiversity. And then, we did some work recently looking at the trade-offs between offshore wind energy and biodiversity in the marine environment. And again, we want to have cleaner energy. We want to have more green energy. Renewable energy is a good way of doing that, but everything has an impact. So can we understand the fact if we do something in some areas, maybe it's going to have more of a negative impact than if we did it somewhere else. So we did this report to say we need both renewable energy and green energy, and we need to protect our environment. And what do we do when those two things are a conflict? Where are the trade-offs involved? So you can make informed decisions about what you're doing. And where do you say one wins over the other area? The other thing as well is we did a report called the European Climate Risk Assessment Report before the summer, and there's a link in the slides I'll give you about that. But we really kind of try to highlight the fact that, as I said at the very start, biodiversity and climate, they're what we call risk multipliers. They exacerbate existing situations, but also that most actions that are positive for biodiversity are positive for climate and vice versa. In the report, we also we don't want to undermine the fact that, these are existential threats to our society. So, I'm kind of giving an overview of where we're at, and I'm a very optimistic person by nature. But, we are in a very extreme situation at the moment, unprecedented in the lifetime of most people who we know. And if you look at the geological record, the decline of biodiversity is sharper than nearly any other time. The increase in temperatures is unprecedented as well. So we're really at this stage where a lot of this is man-made. My mom's family are farmers, and my older uncles, when they talk about when they were younger and the farmland that they knew, is very different to the farmlands that exist now. And that's really within, 50, 60 years, we've changed a lot what we're doing. But it should always be clear as well that the solutions are pretty clear. And we need to see them as an investment, not as a cost. And that, climate and biodiversity solutions go hand in hand. If we continue the decline, it'll cost us billions and billions of euros each year. We know this every time we see these very terrible, unfortunate flooding events or forest fires. If we're lucky, no one is killed by those. But otherwise, they cost an awful lot of money for society to fix and repair. And what we need to really do is understand that we can actually do something about this. We can increase our awareness, we can increase our knowledge, we can lobby local politicians, we can lobby governments to say, you know what, you need to do something about the biodiversity and climate crisis, and you need to do something tangible, because the benefits are really, the beneficial for the entire society as a whole. And that's a lot of what we try to do in our job, is really to sell the fact that we're doing this and it's important. So I hope that was my last slide. So I hope you found it useful and interesting, and that you've been maybe a bit more motivated about biodiversity and a bit more knowledgeable than you were beforehand. I've sent on a list of publications that we've worked on over the last few years, and my slides as well. And there's a few links to the different websites in there. So I hope you found it entertaining and interesting. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Brian McSharry. It was definitely really interesting. We did a collective summary of your presentation in the way, and there was also the possibility to put some questions and answers, and you already have 2 questions. We've got 20 minutes time for questions and answers, so I'm going to encourage everyone that I see that they are already doing it on the Miro to go and take a yellow post-it so you can put some questions. Let's begin with the first one, if it's okay for you.
Yes, please do.
Thank you very much for this really passionate presentation with lots of information, but really nice and useful. We put some quotes as well. So the first question is, what kind of business do the 25% of the businesses that are not dependent on the ecosystem services? Huh? Oh, okay. So there is 25% of the businesses that are not dependent on the ecosystem services, right?
Well, I think that report is a good question. That report talked about it was more or less saying that every business is dependent, but some are a lot more dependent than other ones. And if you think about some of the businesses Like there's a friend of mine has a chocolate shop in Copenhagen where I live. So he's very
Oh,
dependent on biodiversity because his product is cacao and he grows it. So, I was talking to him before and I said, you're a biodiversity business. There's a friend of
mm,
mine that then runs a hotel in Copenhagen. He works in it. So you might say, well, he's not too much, but you could argue that a lot of his customers, some of them are tourists, they come here because they want to have a pleasant climate or a pleasant see some nature, but they also need water and they need clean water for it, for their laundry, and they use cotton for their sheets. So cotton is grown somewhere, and if it's too arid or too dry, you can't grow the cotton, so it gets more expensive. There was a friend of mine was sharing me a story that in Ireland several years ago we had a really, really heavy winter with a lot of frost, which is very unusual. And they started using urea salt to melt the ice on the road, because we didn't have
mm,
a lot of rock salt. And
yeah.
we didn't really think down the line. We just said, well, we need to do this now. And there was Intel, which made computer chips,
Mm,
and their factory stopped working, and they didn't know why. And they worked out that it was because they were getting water from the local stream to cool their equipment. And because of the pollution in the water, their system stopped it coming in because it would corrode the pipes. So, you know, when I talk about it, every computer is dependent on ecosystem services because they need clean water to come in when they're being made. All our food is. So I think if you sat down and went through every business, it's like within 2 or 3 attempts, you're at an ecosystem service. So I think what they were trying to do in that report was that say a lot of companies are very, very dependent
mm,
immediately. But when you think about it, practically every other company is dependent to some
mm,
extent. It may not be directly what they do, like my friend with the hotel, but he
mhm.
works with people getting food coming in. He works in cotton sheets. So down there, what they call the supply chain, there's dependencies coming in. And even with banks, it's, they're at
Yeah,
risk if
definitely.
they give a loan to a farmer and his crops fail, they lose their money.
Mm,
So I think there's very few businesses that are 100% independent of the environment.
mm,
Be a few, but a lot of them, when you start thinking about it, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, they need
mm,
this. And
mm,
anything in tourism is dependent on biodiversity as well, because you're going there to go hiking or kayaking or swimming in clean water and clean air, and that's where you want to get as well.
mm.
So it's more prevalent than you might think.
Yeah, definitely. Including right when we have a phone, we've got an impact. As you said, we have impact on everything, but
Yeah.
there is a question that is linked to it that is like, I think that it's an optimistic person by nature that asked it, and this person is asking how to keep this mind setting optimistic and not get frustrated day by day with all this information and the bad direction, as you said, that we were taking. How can we stay a bit optimistic?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and there's a lot of work being done about like climate fatigue and environment fatigue and
Mm,
biodiversity fatigue from people going, "Oh, is it just so bad? I'm gonna, as we say in English, bury my head in the sand like an ostrich and just ignore it." I mean, even though I was presenting some probably pessimistic figures in there, some of what I was saying was very optimistic. I mean, I've been working in this biodiversity field since the early 2000s,
mhm,
and if you had told me that the European Central Bank or European Investment Bank would be talking about risk from biodiversity for national economies,
mm,
I would have been blown away. That shift in language and understanding, and even though it may not be in the media a lot, or maybe not in political discussions, um, one of the best the presentations in biodiversity I had in the last 2 years was by the Hungarian Central Bank, which looked at what biodiversity loss meant for Hungary as a country. And it was fantastic. It was really good and very emotional. So I think we have been underneath maybe a lot of the headlines. There's a lot of work being done. There's a lot of money being spent on biodiversity. We're increasing the number of protected areas. We're doing a lot of policies like restoration to improve things. We know why. We're trying to make the argument that we need to move from knowing to doing. But it's definitely improving. We can see in the environment that, say, greenhouse gas emission in Europe is plummeting, and practically every country is has been decreasing. The worst country was my home country, Ireland, but we're now back to where we were 30 years ago. So there's no country in Europe is having more emissions than it did 30 years ago. And
Mm,
that's in a time period when our economy has gone like this, our emissions have gone down. So you can
mm,
have both a quality of living and a successful economy, and you can do stuff for the environment. In this case, was climate change.
mm,
We've also increased protected areas in that time. We've increased our knowledge about biodiversity. So I think some of the headlines in media, they're designed to provoke you and get a response. In social media, it's very much about the dopamine receptors and getting things in. They want to get clickbait and want to get discussions. And there are undoubtedly bad stories out there about the state of nature,
mm,
which I always view them as a rallying call. We need to do more. But I mean, having worked in this area, I am optimistic that we know what we need to do. We just have to
mm,
make the next leap in the political conversation to say it's not what we have to do, it's what we need to do.
mm,
And that's where we can all have a role to play in telling people about this, educating about this, voting along those
mm,
lines about this. When you're buying things, think about it from a consumer perspective. What
mm,
am I buying? What food am I buying? Where is it coming from? What does it mean? And we're seeing a lot of businesses they're reading the
mm,
landscape several years ahead, and they're moving into like a more organic or using less fertilizers or better quality
mm,
product. And they know the consumer wants this, and they're getting more sustainable in their how they're doing things, because it's about profits and losses for them. They know that if they want to have a business, they need to make it sustainable. And that's why they're doing a lot of what they're doing. So I think there's a lot of optimism out there. There's definitely some pessimism there. But I
mm,
think the more people are optimistic and then who do, the better we can be. So
mm.
keep the faith. We can do it.
Good. Definitely. And how long does it take, you think, to see the positive consequences of a restoration project, for example?
I think being a scientist, I would say it varies depending, because that's one of the
Hmm.
challenges with biodiversity is some things are pretty instantaneous. Other things take a very long time. But for a lot, you can see things done very quickly. I have friends of mine in Ireland who work in restoring peatlands and bogs. And in a year or two, you can look at a picture and you can see it's improved, it's different. One of the biggest challenges in that landscape is you drain the peatland. So you have all these ditches and you're just taking the water away and you're pumping it out. Once you stop doing that, often naturally the water comes back in because it's there. And you can see 2, 3 years later, it's wetter. There is new moss growing in there. You can see in forests, for example, you might have new saplings growing in there. Forests, to grow big, they take quite a while. It's but you can start seeing it if you have a field, you're returning it to a forest and you leave it there. The all the acorns and everything, all the pod seeds are in the soil. They'll grow up there, and you can see it if you saw an abandoned garden for 6, 7 months. You can see it growing wilder and wilder. And then if you go to grasslands as well, you'll see it very quickly. Just there's more
Hmm.
flowers and there's more pollinators and insects flying around. So
Hmm.
some of those things are very, very quick. And where we live in Copenhagen, they've left in the summer, they leave a lot of the verges growing long. The grass grows long, and you can just see it over 2 months. You can see the grass looks different. You can see more bees. We do it in my garden where half the lawn, I'm lazy, I don't mow it. I say it's for biodiversity value. I get away with it, but I see there's lots of bees. I see there's lots of different flowers coming. And compared to the piece of grass that I mow, there's little flowers. But I can see that in 2 months. Other things
Hmm.
do take longer, especially in the marine environment. It's bigger, and you really need to stop doing things. But so you can see some things very, very quickly. Other things you need to monitor it on a consistent
Hmm.
basis to see that it is improving, improving, improving. But yeah, definitely keep optimistic. That yeah, we can all do it.
Okay. So don't mow your lawn, definitely.
Yes. You can
Um,
mow little bits of it, but you don't have to mow all of it.
and do you think that this biodiversity crisis is understood by the political leaders as well, taking it into account?
Uh, it, I think it's understood by them. I don't necessarily think
Mm,
it's taken into account all the time.
mhm,
we've seen a big change in the last 4 or 5 years. So I've become more politically aware in the last few years when I've been working. As I said, I've worked in this industry for a long time. I haven't always been very politically aware, but I've noticed a lot in the last 4 or 5 years
Mm,
that in 2020 there was a lot of conversation about green, 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 biodiversity, biodiversity, biodiversity. We need to do things. We need to do things. In the EU Parliament elections and a lot of elections across Europe, that language has been a bit lost. Um, Being an optimist, I think it is just one level underneath
mm,
because the new commissioner of environment for Europe, Jessica Roswell from Sweden, when she was being interviewed by the European Parliament, she said, you need nature to have a competitive economy. And
mm,
he said, you need nature, biodiversity. So you need it. And what I took from that was kind of one of these non-negotiable things. Like, so why do I need to stay? It's important because it is important. And if we want to have a competitive economy in Europe, I have to have what we call these enabling conditions. I have to have good quality biodiversity. It's crazy to even think I wouldn't. So that's how I see it. But it's absent. I mean,
mm.
in Ireland, there's elections coming on Friday, and being a bit
Oh,
of a political geek, I've been reading the newspapers, and green and the environment isn't anywhere mentioned. But to do what they're talking about, they need to have this. And I was talking to some people working for government agencies in Ireland, and they were saying it's there, but it's just maybe a bit hidden at the moment.
mm,
And that's how we all look at it: is that you can't have a successful economy in a country or Europe without having a
mm,
positive biodiversity. It's as simple
mm.
as
Yes, definitely. We still have 5 minutes to chat, more or less, and I have 5 questions as well. Maybe I can try to
that.
give you several questions at the same time. Can we challenge? Can I challenge you with that?
Yes. Let's
Um,
go for it and see how good I am.
Okay, so there is a question that is linked with the previous one. That is how the EU policy on biodiversity is coordinated with the agricultural policy, because there is a common criticism of EU, that is that subsidies go to very large farms, while its smaller farms are usually implementing more environmentally friendly practices. So it's about the EU policy, the subsidies that goes to large farm, while the smaller ones are more eco-friendly. Linked to that, there is also the target, 30% to restore, conserve. Isn't it too small to change the current trend? And there is also a question about contradiction. Isn't it contradictory to talk about constant growth and restoration of biodiversity? This is
Some very good questions, and I'll try and do my best to answer them. I might have to be a bit diplomatic in some of the answers. Um,
okay.
but there is a little bit of there's a bit of lack of coherence between our biodiversity and agricultural policies, and that much I think is very clear. Everyone would appreciate that. I would say that there is a challenge in Europe about subsidies. The Common Agricultural Policy gives a lot of subsidies to the farming community. It's probably also the largest provider of subsidies for biodiversity conservation as well. And you raised a point there about the large and the small. There are some areas where it's unfair, and we've talked to the Agricultural Commission, and they're aware of that. And it's trying, how do you make the best decisions possible? And invariably, you're not getting it right 100% of the time. It's difficult when there's all these different individual peculiarities and things. But I
Mm,
know there's active discussions about how to make these things more coherent. The challenge is that often when these conversations happen, you're going in one direction. You've got I'm rather from an agriculture or fishing background, and I'm pushing that lobby, and I'm going for the biodiversity, and we're at conflict. The reality is that we're really so connected that we should be speaking the same language and the same voice, but sometimes there's a rhetoric of conflict kind of assumed from these things, and we try to work to mitigate that and resolve that. It is there, and I know conversations are happening to try
mm,
and get rid of it. We'll never get there 100%, but I think we can do a better job than we currently are. Next on the targets, yes, they are too small. This is what happens when you put science and politics together. You end up out of compromise.
Mm,
And compromise, I think when we saw the figures, we weren't, as scientists, we weren't particularly happy. I think some of the policymakers weren't particularly happy. They thought it was too high. We thought it was too low.
mm,
They often say that's the sign of a good negotiation when no one is happy. But when I look at it, it's a start, and we need to start getting going somewhere. We have a target of 20% for
mm,
2030, but the target for 2050 is all that need it. So I have been saying we need to act, and we need to act now. We need to be a bit realistic about what we can and cannot do in those things. So while I might want all by 2030, it's not realistic to do that. And I think if we want this to succeed, it has to be realistic
mm.
and achievable. We often hear about SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. That's what
We
we
have a
need.
workshop on that tomorrow.
Yeah, it's very important. And this is where we have to put reality into what we want to do. And again, we're moving in the right direction, which I think is the important thing. Pushing a bit better is always good, but we're definitely going there. And then your last one was contradictions in growth and restoration. Not necessarily. There can, of course, if you're doing two things that are in conflict.
Mm,
But I would say, I hope I've made it clear. There's a lot of arguments that would show that to have growth, you need to have healthy biodiversity, and to have healthy biodiversity, you need to restore.
mm,
So you might have a conflict in a particular space, particular piece of geography. You could have a conflict between one activity and another activity. You step it up to a more systems perspective, I don't see it as a conflict. But when you have that one where there's a piece of geography where I want to do A and I should be doing B, yeah, you have conflict. And then you need to think about, well, what's better for the overall? What gets you your end goal better? And you need to then think about it not being just unique and one off. So I make a decision here, here, and here. But,
mm,
am I making a planning decision? Where should I do this? And what should I do? Um, so that's what I would say is that there can be the risk of a contradiction with growth and restoring, but done correctly, they're actually they're enabling.
mm,
Restoration will enable growth.
mm,
Maybe slightly different growth than you might think of originally, but yeah, it's something you have to consider.
mm. Okay. Um, Maybe a last question,
Yeah.
if it's okay for you. It said that countries have to report on the state of nature, but what if they are corrupted or ignorant and their data is not good? Is there some additional monitoring measures? What can we
Yeah.
do if we see that the
It,
policies are not
it's
respected?
a very good question. I would say from having worked on that for several years, I see very few cases where that's actually happening.
Mm,
There's a few cases where we can see the data isn't of the quality it is. When we work with people on this work, we're invariably dealing with the conservationists and the biologists and the scientists, and they're very open and honest with us, and
mm,
they're always trying to do their very best. You can sometimes have challenges at different levels in government. I wouldn't say corruption. I would just say some people want to present a slightly different narrative of things. Um,
mhm,
what we do in those cases is when we look at it, we can spot these very clearly because they're a potentially anomalous result. They stand out like a sore thumb. We When we're doing the state of nature, we take on board what the countries have given us and we double check all of that and we apply our own knowledge. But then we hire a group of scientists to evaluate all of the data, and they work with a lot of NGOs
mm,
to help us understand, is country A saying something that maybe is not necessarily correct. And we do change things a little bit from that. We flag where we see there's an incoherence. It's not dramatic when we do it. Sometimes you might have slight differences of opinions in how some species or things were collected or monitored. But
mhm,
we do this kind of sense checking, and a lot of NGOs do a lot of work as well, where they take this
mm,
information and they will they'll check it against their own version. And some NGOs may have an agenda, some or don't. But again, it provokes a conversation, and because it's all public and out there, if you were, say, in your own country and you disagree with it, you can go back and say, "Wow, that's not correct."
Mm.
And then the country would say, "Well, this is our evidence for why we came to this." They have to document it. And then you might say, "Oh, but I see a problem here, here, and here." And it opens a conversation. And because it's a law in Europe, you can then contact the European Commission and they can launch legal proceedings against the country. And that has happened, that, some NGOs or citizens will say, we don't believe country X is doing enough. And the Commission, they have sued countries and given them fines. So this kind of, in Europe, we're lucky. We have a lot of countries which are very democratic and very willing to do things, but we have another level that actually checks and monitors that they're doing what they're meant to be doing as well, and can be punitive in what they're doing. But I would say most countries we see are very positive about this. We're dealing with people who really want this.
Mhm.
I've seen globally some of those corruptions where very false data comes out, but these days with the accessibility of data and processing capabilities, it's very easy to check if a country is not telling the truth. And then we're trying to monitor as well. There's a lot of discussion about how we can use remotely sensed and Earth observations from satellites to monitor things independently. And that works for some things very, very well. It doesn't work for other things very well. But where it does work, let's do it. Where it doesn't work, maybe let's try to see, can we or
Mm.
not? But yeah, it's a good where we keep on trying to, we have good relationships with countries. They're very honest with us about what their challenges are. And we do check that and we see where we're going. But overall, I've been very impressed with the honesty of countries that I work with when we're
Okay.
doing this.
Okay, that's a good news, and maybe that explains as well why you stay optimistic.
Yes.
Maybe just to conclude, what would you say to all green contact points that are here all across Europe? What can we do in our daily life, in our walks like that, to have a positive impact on biodiversity? Just to conclude.
I would say, well, first of all, thanks for listening to me, and your questions were very useful. I'd say what you can do is just appreciate the fact that you probably are an influencer to people about different elements, and you can probably either have conversations with them or act in a certain way that is positive for the nature of the environment around us. It could be promoting things in your workplace about either walking to work or cycling to work or recycling or reducing. In your organization, do you have committees looking at the environment or what you're doing in your building? Having training courses for staff and students and other people working in your organization about maybe, a similar presentation to what I gave, like you care about biodiversity, even if you don't know, or promoting walks in nature. I've got a friend of mine who works for a company and they do volunteering work where they help out with local NGOs where they either clean a stretch of a river or they help out in a national park or a nature reserve near an urban area. Um, so a lot of volunteering can help. But then I think helping make, if there's political elections happening, ask people, what are you doing about this? So there's a lot you can do being advocating, but also just in what you're doing as well yourself.
Mm, okay. So advocate and do positive things for biodiversity. Thank you so much, Dr.
You're
Brian.
very welcome, Charlotte. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you all so much for your questions and for listening to me. It was great.